Okay. Gregory, we are very, very honored to have you with us in the online form of communication. Thank you so much for joining us. And the first question I would like to ask you is very broad and general, but I would like to ask you about what you think on the universality of the motto "Never Again."
Yeah, I'm happy and thank you very much, Rafal. Rafal is one of our very most outstanding leaders in the whole anti-genocide movement. His organization, Never Again, has been a real leader in explaining to people why genocide happens and in fact, taking a very active role in trying to prevent it. Um, Never Again is a motto that was adopted after the Holocaust. Because people realized that a crime this large as the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were killed and another 6 million people from other countries, especially in Poland, were murdered in the Soviet Union. This is a crime that is so big that a lot of people realized the world can't withstand this kind of crime. And that is why the Genocide Convention was formulated and passed by the United Nations. Uh, it was, of course, the invention of a Polish lawyer, a Jewish man named Raphael Lemkin, who began to think about genocide even before the Holocaust when he started to study the Armenian genocide. And he realized that this was a general problem of mankind. In fact, it probably had been a general problem since the beginning of history. It seems that people identify with certain groups, that is, especially ethnic, national, religious, and racial groups, and then they begin, under the influence of pathological leaders, to believe that other groups are threats to them. And so, in doing that, they then try to justify their own massacre and murder of these other groups. Raphael Lemkin realized there was no crime uh, yet to do that, to actually outlaw the actual attempt to destroy a whole group or a part of a group. And so that's why the Genocide Convention came about. Raphael Lemkin was the man, the great man. He should have gotten the Nobel Prize, no doubt about it, who invented this concept and then pushed it through the UN. In fact, his autobiography is one of the most inspiring books I've ever read. Uh, Never Again was the motto of the UN at the time when that Genocide Convention was passed. The whole problem with it is that, unfortunately, we don't yet have the international institutions to really enforce it. In other words, where the UN was founded to prohibit war and to outlaw genocide, it has failed to do both. And even though the UN is a very important institution, the things that it does, the World Health Organization, all of the things it does, the World Food Program, all these things are so important. Nevertheless, the basic structure of the UN makes it so that it can't really stop war or genocide. Part of it is the permanent five veto in the Security Council. Any of the permanent five members of the Security Council, the US, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, if any of them veto a resolution in the Security Council that is intended to, stop a genocide, then it can't be stopped. In fact, they can commit the genocides themselves without any consequences. So that fundamental weakness in the UN structure is one of the reasons why the UN Charter needs to be revised. It needs to be, in fact, rewritten. And Genocide Watch is working on that project right now. Now, the word never again, unfortunately, has become a again and again. The truth is that at least 50, probably more, genocides have occurred since the Genocide Convention came into force in 1952. And you can look all around the world, and there have been genocides. We know, of course, of the most obvious ones, the most recent ones, in Myanmar, in Sudan right now, where we have this terrible double genocide occurred by both the government of Sudan and by the Rapid Support Forces, which is a civil war, but it's also a genocide. A lot of people think war and genocide are different and mutually exclusive. The fact is, most genocides occur during wars, either civil rights wars or international wars. So unfortunately, never again has become again and again. And we need to create the international institutions to stop it. That's what the international movement that Genocide Watch and the Alliance Against Genocide started is all about. And that is why it's so important that you, who are leaders in Uganda, know how you can stop it in Uganda. Because the unfortunate history is that Uganda has had several genocides, and it could happen again. As you know, and I am an Africanist, I'm an anthropologist as well as an international lawyer. But it's not just in Africa, it's in Europe too. I mean, the worst genocides, in fact, have occurred in Europe and in Asia. But the truth is that, these are human weaknesses. We are ethnic. That is, we believe we are born into an ethnic group. We are born into speaking a certain language, a certain culture, and so forth. And when a pathological leader comes along who can convince us that somehow our ethnic group is superior to another one, or that we are under threat from another group, or even our national group is under threat, it then becomes a justification for mass murder. And that is the basis, really, of war. It's also the basis of genocide.
My next question, you are very well known internationally for many things, including the concept of 10 stages of genocide. So may I ask you, what inspired you to develop this concept?
I was called to go to Cambodia in 1980. I was just finishing my second year of law school at Yale Law School. And I got a call from Church World Service saying, we would like you to go set up the relief program in Phnom Penh. When I got to Cambodia, it was filled with literally over 1,000 mass graves. Every family had lost members of its family. You could talk to anyone and they wanted to tell you their stories. It was the first genocide I'd ever seen. And I realized this huge problem that had killed at least 2 million Cambodians, probably more, was a basic problem that people all around the world had experienced, many places. So I began to study not only the Cambodian genocide, but also what had happened in the Holocaust, in the Armenian genocide, again and again, as I said. And what I realized as a structural anthropologist is there are predictable processes that lead to genocide. It's a lot like the processes that lead to children's development, or that lead to the ability to learn language and so forth. These are structures that, in other words, are predictable. You can see how children progress in their development, for instance. Well, it's very similar to other things where you can predict the development process. Well, what I saw was that as an anthropologist, that these processes are identifiable. They're predictable. Doesn't mean that they follow in a particular order, or that they can be inexorable. That is, that they cannot be prevented. Because what I realized was that each of these processes, in fact, can be stopped. And so I really started thinking through, okay, what is similar about the Holocaust, Armenian genocide, Cambodia? There's so many genocides had occurred. And this was in 1980 when I started thinking about this. Eventually, I came to the conclusion that there were these predictable processes. And I had a model that included 8 stages of genocide, 8 processes. I regret using the word stages because it has a linearity to it. That is, that if you think somehow it has to be stage 1 and then 2 and 3 and 4. No, it doesn't work that way. In fact, a lot of these stages are simultaneous. A lot of them happen together. That's why I really should have just called these processes. But anyway, keep that in mind, that each of these processes is a process itself. And there are certain characteristics of either of these processes. Just to keep this in mind as I describe the processes, these are not in order, it's not linear, but there is a logic to them. And that's what I'll go through it with you. The first is classification. That's the us versus them stage, if you will, or process. It's how we, in a particular group, in an ethnic group, a racial group, a religious group, a national group, think of us belonging to a group. And then there are the them, the other people who do not belong to our group. Now, if you don't have classification, you can't have a genocide because you can't even have an other. So at that stage, in that process, you can take steps to try to avoid this kind of classification. In other words, if you can find a transcendent, unifying classification, say a national identity, for instance, or some other unity that will unite people, you can overcome the classification. That's why it's so important to have citizenship, because citizenship in a particular country overcomes a lot of the differences that may exist within that country. And one of the first things that dictators try to do against targeted people is take away their citizenship. So keep that in mind as the, if you will, first stage. The second is symbolization, because we as human beings use symbols. We use language. We identify and name other groups. So this is a Tutsi, this is a Hutu, this is a Twa, this is, or a German or a French person or something like that. You have these different ways of symbolizing. And the symbols can often be even physical. The different dress that people have, the kind of language they speak. These are really built in as symbolic expressions. Sometimes the symbols are actually imposed on a group that's targeted. The most famous example are the yellow stars that the Nazis imposed on Jews. They said every Jew has to wear one of these yellow stars. It was a form of symbolization, saying these are, the pariah people. These are the people we are against. So this process of symbolization can also be stopped. One of the things that the Germans tried to do in Denmark, for instance, was get the Danes to put yellow stars on all the Jews who lived in Denmark. Well, the legend is the Danish king said, well, if you're putting yellow stars on our Jews, I'm going to be the first to wear one. In other words, he said, no, we are not going to do it. We're not putting yellow stars on Jewish people here. They also had a very organized program to help their Jews escape to Sweden across, the water that was there. It was not very far. And they just got their fishing boats and other things and took nearly all the Jews in Denmark to Sweden where they were safe. The same thing, and this is almost unknown to a lot of people, happened in Bulgaria. The Bulgarian president and the Bulgarian Orthodox Church said, no, these people are Bulgarians. We are not putting yellow stars on our Jews here. And they were just refused to do it. In fact, the only time those were ever used was after the Germans took direct control of Bulgaria, right near the end of the Second World War. The result? Only 13% of the Jews in Bulgaria perished during the Holocaust. It's the lowest percentage of any country in Europe. And it's because they said, we are not going to make it easy for you to know who's Jewish. The third stage, if you will, is discrimination, where a group that is targeted is discriminated against. One of the ways, for instance, the Nazis did was to make it illegal for Jews to hold professorships in universities or to hold government offices or government in the German government. They fired all these people. They, in fact, discriminated against them in many other ways as well. They had laws that outlawed, for instance, intermarriage between Jews and so-called Germans or Aryans, people who were the chosen people, if you will. Were the so-called chosen people, of course, were Jews according to them, their own doctrines. Germans said, no, 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 you're not the chosen people. Aryans are the chosen people. And so we're not letting our people intermarry with you. We had the same kinds of intermarriage laws in the United States. Whites and blacks could not intermarry in a lot of our states. Virginia, where I come from, is one of the states. It was literally illegal for a black person to marry a white person. And that was law until the 1960s, when finally, in a very appropriately named case, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck down all of these laws that forbade interracial marriage. The name of the case was Loving versus Virginia. A couple whose last name was Loving were the ones who sued. I think it's the most appropriate name I've ever heard of for a Supreme Court case. But this kind of intermarriage law was also true, for instance, in Rwanda, where it was heavily discouraged for Hutus to marry Tutsis. And in fact, it was, if you were part of the presidential guard in Rwanda, and you could not marry a Tutsi. It was actually against the law. This is discrimination discrimination happens in many, many countries. It doesn't always lead to genocide. But the next stage is the process is really an important one in the process of genocide, and that is dehumanization. It is treating another group as though they were less than human. It's calling them cockroaches, as the Tutsis were called in Rwanda. It's calling them rats or vermin, as the Nazis called the Jews. It's calling them a disease in the body politic. It's calling them dirt or impurity in the nation. And so you get these formulations in which people who are wanting to commit genocide say it's time for us to purify the country. And of course, that means we have to kill all these other people who are the disease, they're the impurity, they're the dirt that is polluting our country. This sort of dehumanization is important in genocide because it makes it easy for people to consider the person they're killing as not fully human. In other words, it's an antidote to feeling guilt about murder. It makes it easy to murder. After all, it's like killing a cockroach, or a rat. So this dehumanization process is very important in the genocidal process. When you see it being used, you should be screaming bloody murder. Because, for instance, when I hear President Trump declaring that these people coming across our southern border in the United States are criminals or rapists or, somehow mentally ill, or all of these kinds of dehumanizing things that he calls these people, that is dehumanization. You should be screaming when you hear that kind of language. because that kind of language is what makes genocide possible. The next stage is organization. That is the stage at which hate groups form that are dedicated to, in fact, eliminating another group. We had the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. We still have the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. I know because I was a civil rights worker in Mississippi under the Voting Rights Act. We would go around and help Black people go to register with federal registrars who had been imposed on the southern states who were refusing to register Black voters. We were followed around by the Ku Klux Klan. And one night, they shot up our house. A couple of my friends in the front room were wounded by these guys. These are terrorists. That sort of organization of hate groups is characteristic of genocides. In Rwanda, for instance, the Interahamwe were one of the hate groups that was organized to kill Tutsis. You find the very same kind of thing with the Janjaweed in Sudan, where the Janjaweed, who were called devils on horseback in Arabic, were militias that were organized to kill Black people. They're largely Arab, and their aim is to get the Black people out of Sudan, to push them out of Sudan and push them off their land so it can be resettled by Arabs. And of course, the area they're trying to do that in is Darfur, where there's a lot of oil, there's a lot of gold, there's a lot of resources, and it is largely populated by Black people. Well, the Arabs decided they want that land, they want those resources, so they're trying to murder the Black people and take over Darfur. That's the group called the Rapid Support Forces, which is just another name that was given to them by the Sudanese government for the Janjaweed, these devils on horseback. So what you've got here is organization. After organization, the organized hate groups go to the next stage, which is polarization. The idea is to drive out the moderates, drive out the middle, drive out the people from your own group who might oppose you. So the first people to be targeted in a genocide are often people from the perpetrator group who want to eliminate the moderates from their own group. So the very first people to be arrested, for instance, in Nazi Germany, were liberal priests, communists who were opposed to the Hitler regime, socialists. In other words, people who were Germans, not Jews, just ordinary Germans, but who would oppose Hitler. And they were the first ones to be locked up in Dachau, one of the first concentration camps. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a famous victim of that. He was a liberal pastor, opposed to Hitler, had the courage to actually go back to Germany under Hitler because he believed he was called by God to go back and be a witness against this Nazi regime. And they arrested him, and just before the end of the Second World War, murdered him. After you have polarization, you're going to have preparation. Preparation is when you plan the genocide. The preparation stage is often one in which there are lots of meetings of this perpetrator group saying, okay, next thing we're going to do is we're going to have gas chambers, and we're going to build them. And we're going to have all the people who we want to kill, the Jews, and we're going to send them by train to get to those gas chambers. So they built a lot of those in Poland, in fact. These death camps, the most famous ones, of course, Auschwitz and some others. But these sorts of concentration camps have also been characteristic in other genocides. The Serbs who wanted to murder a lot of Bosnian Muslims, for instance, they sent the Bosnian Muslims that the Nazis in Europe, in Poland, in preparation stage. The most famous was Berlin, where the top leaders in the Nazi regime actually planned the extermination of the Jews in Eastern Europe. They'd already killed thousands and thousands of Jews, but this was how to totally eliminate the Jewish population. After you have planning, preparation, you get persecution. The whole idea is build the camps, take those people that you want to persecute, put them in the camps, and then essentially starve them to death. Or you don't even have to build camps. You can just take the Armenians, for instance, and march them out of the Armenian part of what is now Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, march them across the desert, give them no food, no water, and they will die. They will starve. And so over 1.5 million Armenians were murdered that way. That sort of persecution is the early stages of it. There's many other kinds of persecution. You arrest leaders, you put them in torture chambers, you kill some of the moderate leaders, you do all that kind of persecution of the group you're targeting. Finally, you get extermination. Extermination is what is legally called genocide. It's where you actually kill members of the group. One of the things, though, to keep in mind about genocide is it's not just killing. It could also be creating mental and physical harm to members of the group, serious mental or physical harm that is intended to destroy part of the group. You don't have to kill the whole group or have this kind of harm to the whole group. Part of the group is enough in the Genocide Convention. Thirdly, you can have creating conditions of life intended to destroy the group. One of the most common is, in fact, starvation. And we're seeing it right now in Gaza. The Israeli genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, one of the main ways they're using is starvation. So that kind of persecution, and by the way, it of course didn't just start recently in Gaza. This kind of persecution has been going on for a very long time. Similarly, the persecution of Jews went on for a very long time in pretty much all of Europe before the Holocaust. Jews were, forced to live in ghettos. They were excluded from most of society and so forth. But persecution then leads to actual extermination. And that is what we saw many times in many countries. What I had forgotten when I first wrote my stage theory about genocide, I had forgotten the final stage, which is denial. Now, it's unlike the others because it starts right at the beginning and it goes all the way through, and it may last for 100 years after a genocide. That is what we see, for instance, in Turkey, where they still don't want to admit that the Turkish regime, the Young Turks, massacred 1.5 million Armenians, the Armenian genocide. Turkey's still in denial about it. In fact, after every genocide that I have studied, there is denial by the perpetrator group that they did the genocide. And the tactics of denial are very, very predictable also. You deny the statistics. You say, oh, no, it wasn't, 2 million in Cambodia. I've actually heard people say this. It was only 200,000. What? Only 200,000? Wait a minute. I actually heard that said by a, pro-communist speaker at this university where I was speaking. He didn't want to admit that the Khmer Rouge had killed 2 million Cambodians. Only 2,000? Wait a minute. That's one type of tactic. Another is to blame it on the victims. Say, oh, no, they were enemies. They were attacking us. So we had no choice. We had to kill them. There are so many other tactics, and I have an essay there on our website. Please look up our website. It's simply genocidewatch.com. One word, genocidewatch.com. Just look it up. And we have some essays about denial and how it works. The Holocaust was denied by so many Holocaust deniers after the Holocaust. They said, "Oh no, there were no gas chambers. No. That's a myth made up by propagandists." Well, the truth is, it was not a myth. There really were gas chambers, and they have found them, and they found a lot of other evidence that the Holocaust was not some kind of imagination. It wasn't some kind of propaganda. It actually happened, and to deny it is then the way you can create the conditions for future genocide against the same group. Uh, Denial is one of the most verifiable ways to predict future genocides that we have found. I mean, it's statistically, we've actually done the statistics on this. It makes a genocide 3 times as likely in a country that denies that it has committed genocide. Turkey is a good example, where after the Armenian genocide, now they're after the Kurds. It's a country in denial. Our country, the U.S., has been in denial about our genocide against our own Native Americans. Well, from the start, really, from the beginning of the country's history. It was founded by white supremacists. It was a group of people who thought God had given this land. It's called the Manifest Destiny Doctrine. And so therefore they had a right to push the Indians, as they were often called, the Native Americans, off their land and kill them, massacre them. That was denied for right up into my lifetime. I mean, I remember the cowboy movies where the Indians were always the bad guys, and the cowboys would go around shooting them, and people cheered, these were the bad people. Well, that's the kind of ideology of dehumanization that allowed for that genocide. We're beginning to confront that history now, but now we have a president who wants to deny it again. So they're taking it out of the history lessons in Florida and a lot of other states. They are not allowing the teachers to teach the truth about American history, which is we committed genocide against our own Native Americans. We also committed genocide against our own African Americans. During the slave trade, a good quarter of the people who were put on the ships to ship them from Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean died on ship. They died. Their bodies were thrown overboard. Now, when you kill a quarter of the people that you're, supposedly transporting to the Caribbean or America, I'd say that's genocide. And a lot of people, because they say, "Oh, but we didn't intend to." Wait a minute. If you put them on those ships and you knew a quarter of them were going to die, I'd say that's a good evidence of intent. Now, that's one of the problems with the definition of genocide in the convention. You have to prove intent because it's an intentional crime. And a lot of people say, well, I remember this in the State Department when I was there during the Rwandan genocide. I said, isn't this a genocide? And Joan Donahue was the legal advisor to the Africa department in the genocide, in the State Department. Said, no, we don't have enough evidence of intent. I said, but Joan, they're killing 10,000 people a day. How else can you call that except that it's intentional? She said, well, we really don't know. We do. And that same kind of denial of intention is used even by some genocide experts. One of them is William Chavez, for instance. He's a friend. Believe me, I have nothing against him as a person at all. In fact, he followed me as president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. But he denies that the Holodomor in Ukraine was intentional. It was just, it was, he thinks it was to against class warfare and stuff. He also denied the Cambodian genocide was a genocide because of this whole concept of it. He denies that The intent there was, quote, ethnic cleansing, which is, by the way, a word I hate because it was invented by Slobodan Milosevic, the Serb leader, to cover up genocide. Ethnic cleansing essentially means forced displacement. And Chavez and some others think that it's either that or genocide. No, they go together. In fact, every genocide I've studied has both, where you try to expel a whole group of people. The Kosovars, for instance, in Kosovo, the Serbs tried to expel them and drive them out of Kosovo, and they they did it through genocidal massacres, terrorizing the Kosovars into leaving, and they headed west to Albania, or towards Albania. That, by the way, was a genocide that was stopped. And one of the reasons it was stopped is that the US and European countries said, no, you're not going to do this. And so we're sending in NATO and we're going to stop you. And they started to bomb Belgrade. NATO bombed Belgrade. And Slobodan Milosevic realized he couldn't defeat NATO. And he surrendered. He ordered his troops out of Kosovo, and that war was stopped, and that genocide was stopped. So there, if you have forceful intervention, even when the genocide has begun, you can stop it. A good example, a personal example for me, was the Rwandan genocide. That genocide could have been prevented. You could see it coming. In fact, I lived in Rwanda in 1988 and 89. I was brought in as an academic specialist to look at the justice system because it just wasn't working. It was a Belgian justice system that didn't work in Africa. And I'm an anthropologist. I went around and asked everybody, why isn't this working? They had all kinds of really foolish rules, like they had to have 3 judges for the tiniest case and this kind of thing. They wore wigs, would you believe? This kind of stuff. And so I saw these weaknesses in the system, but I also, in interviewing people, found out that they had a traditional form of justice called the gacaca system, which is justice on the grass, as it's called in Rwanda. And it worked. It was a much better way to resolve conflicts than this Belgian system. So I recommended the Minister of Justice that they readopt the gacaca system for most cases. Sure, in extreme criminal cases of murder and stuff like this, maybe then they would use a trial court, but not using the Belgian trial court, though. Please make it African. But he said, no, we can't do that because, they'd say we're primitive. I said, what? I said, no, they'll just say you're African. I had seen a really good justice, a really good peace system in Ivory Coast, where I lived, in Cote d'Ivoire. I lived there for 4 years, learned the language, I was part of the age set system. Yeah, we men sat around, drank, gin and palm wine and stuff on Saturdays, and the women cooked for us. I mean, what a system. Anyway, we had these marvelous celebrations. And anyway, I was part of an African society, and I saw them use what they call the palaver system to settle conflicts, in which they would pick a mediator. Both people would agree on a mediator, often one of the, officials in the village, a chief or someone, and they'd tell their side of the story to that person who was a mediator, and then that mediator would tell what he had just heard from the other person to the other person in the conflict. And it would go back and forth between that, through the mediator, between these two people who were sitting right there, until the mediator would always defuse the bombs that were being thrown from one side to the other. In fact, I could say this as a diplomat, to make the speech diplomatic for the other person to be able to hear it. And it would go back and forth like this. That society was the most conflict-free society I have ever lived in. People just didn't have violent disputes. They settled them. I mean, I wish we had a system that was that good in the United States. We don't. We have so much violence in the United States, so much violence. Uh, yes, this is an African society that was far more civilized than ours. And I think that's true in a lot of African societies, actually. It's only this white supremacist racism that ignores that fact, because African civilization is a really profoundly wise civilization in many, many places. I know that's true in Uganda because I have a Dutch brother who practiced medicine in Fort Portal, Uganda. You know, this is a great country you have in Uganda, a really great country, one of Africa's greatest. And the fact that you've also had, you know, pathological leaders like Idi Amin and others come along shows you that even in a healthy society, you can have people who are leaders like that, who can then, I think, take over the society and have it commit major crimes. I think that's what's happening right now in the United States. Trump is a racist, no question. He's a white supremacist, and he is trying to deport many, many people who are from, you know, who are dark skinned. I mean, people who are from Latin America or from Africa or other places. He's in favor, get this, he wants to change our refugee policy uh, so that we will favor only white people. I mean, this is back to the 1800s, you know, that kind of a policy. This is one of the great things about the United States is our diversity. This is a man who he doesn't believe in it. He really should have been born in the 19th century if he wanted to be that racist. Actually, though, I've seen it also in the South, in the when I was a civil rights worker there. Essentially, in the South, we had a type of Nazi regime. It was white supremacist. It was run by whites. It was a police state. Blacks could not vote. Blacks would be targeted for murders, for lynchings, and so forth. I lived in that society. I saw the water fountains that were labeled colored and white, you know, where they wouldn't let African Americans go into restaurants. They had to get their food from a window, you know, on the outside of the restaurant. I mean, this is the sort of society we lived in. It was segregation, they called it. It was apartheid. That's what it was. I'm right now right now I'm speaking to you from a country that actually experienced apartheid. And it was very similar to the United States, also based on white supremacy. And fortunately, this country the had the visionary leadership, especially of two men, Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk. A lot of people don't know this about de Klerk. I knew him. I also know Mandela's daughter, by the way, who is a member of a group that Martin Luther King III formed called Realizing the Dream. And Bishop Tutu's daughter is also part of that group. De Klerk went to the United States at the height of the civil rights movement for a year under a fellowship he got from the State Department, and he studied the civil rights movement. He realized that's what South Africa needed too. But in his case, it would come from the top down. He was there with a group of people, the Afrikaners, who were white supremacists, and he himself was Afrikaner, and he knew he had to lead his own people out of this system of injustice. Similarly, Gorbachev saw that about the Soviet Union. I knew him too. You see, if you live long enough, you kind of get to know a whole lot of people. But these visionaries are the ones who are going to lead us out of this kind of separation that has plagued the human race, probably from the beginning. That's what the whole Tower of Babel story is in the Bible. It's what it's all about our separation. And I have hopes that we can overcome it. Well, I hope that's that explanation for you for the 10 stages.
Thank you so much, Gregory. I think you are definitely one of the world's visionaries, and I really appreciate your words. So time is flying. Our very last question would be about the Alliance Against Genocide. So, of course, you are well known as a scholar. You're also an activist. And you already mentioned Genocide Watch. But the Alliance Against Genocide, could you please tell us a little bit about that? And maybe especially in the context of Sudan today?
Sure, of course. At the time we founded Genocide Watch, which was in 1999, I had already worked on the Cambodian genocide to get the Khmer Rouge put on trial for the genocide they committed in Cambodia. And I had joined the State Department, in fact, with that in mind. Uh, I realized that the U.S. policy, which was against trials for the Khmer Rouge, needed to be reversed. So we actually got a law passed in the legislature in the United States, and it was signed by President Clinton, and it was the Cambodian Genocide Justice Act. But I realized if we were going to have it actually have an effect, which was to have trials, somebody needed to join the State Department in person and push it through. So I quit my law professorship, joined the State Department, was was appointed to the Cambodian Genocide working group, and also was put in a position after the Rwandan genocide happened, where I was writing our UN resolutions on Africa. So I was the one who wrote the UN resolutions to create the Rwandan tribunal, for instance, the Cambodian tribunal, helped to create the International Criminal Court, and so forth. But when the US voted against the International Criminal Court in Rome in 1998, I realized this was not enough. We had to have a mass movement that would force governments to oppose genocide and take action to stop it. And I looked around, there wasn't a movement. There were good human rights organizations. I've been part of Amnesty International practically since it started. And Human Rights Watch, was led by Ken Roth, who was one of my classmates at Yale Law School. And I mean, these were great groups, but they didn't focus on this problem of genocide, which was the most deadly problem that we faced. It had killed genocide had killed more people than all the wars combined in the 20th century. Governments killed their own people. They killed more of their own people than all those wars combined. The Soviet Union killed 60 million of its own people. China is about the same number. I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it? And so what we needed was a mass movement that would help build the institutional structure we need to actually stop genocides. So I resigned from the State Department in 1999 to start Genocide Watch, but at the same time to start the Alliance Against Genocide. Because when I asked, experts on human rights and who had founded other groups, like, for instance, the International Crisis Group, they said, don't try to start a new pyramid. Don't try to make it a hierarchical, top-down organization. Make it a network, because a network is far more powerful. You can do things with a network you could never do with a pyramidal structure. So start an alliance as well. At the same time you start Genocide Watch. We founded Genocide Watch at the Hague Appeal for Peace in 1999. At the same time, we founded the Alliance Against Genocide. At that time, we called it the International Campaign to End Genocide. But then people said, wait a minute, you think you're really going to end genocide? Well, maybe I'm too optimistic. So I said, well, okay, well, then we're going to change the name to Alliance Against Genocide. But by recruiting other groups, like Never Again, for instance, one of our best members, to work together to oppose genocide and to help us build the structures we need. We now have 130 members in the Alliance Against Genocide, many of them much bigger than Genocide Watch. International Crisis Group is huge. It's got people everywhere. It's got the minority rights group, Survival International, Never Again. I mean, these are all bigger than Genocide Watch. And so we have, and by the way, this was another thing that I was told, and it was because the age of the internet had begun, is that you could actually do organizational work without having the huge institutional structures that were necessary to build, all of the world's major corporations, for instance, big buildings and, factories and all that other kind of thing, because we had virtual communications. We've only really begun to discover virtual communications, I think, since COVID, but we knew that they were there. So we had the internet, we had web presence and things like that right from the start. The Alliance is organized around that kind of virtual organization. We have meetings, as you've just heard from Rafal, regularly with members in the Alliance. They do their projects. We don't try to tell them what to do or anything. Each of them has their own projects, their own fundraising and so forth. But working together, we can really achieve a lot. One of the things, for instance, the Alliance was able to do was to get the United Nations to create the Office of the Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General for the Prevention of Genocide. It's an idea that I wrote a paper about in the year 2000, saying we need this focal point, this office in the UN, because when East Timor blew up, we started calling people in the UN, and they would say, "Oh, well, you should call it to this other office." We found out there wasn't an office for the prevention of genocide, and so I wrote this paper saying we needed that kind of an office in the UN. And so we lobbied Kofi Annan and his advisors, Donald Turk, Ed Mortimer, his speechwriter, and others at the top of the UN. And so in 2004, Kofi Annan announced the creation of the Office of Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide at the UN, and it's still going strong. And it's had some wonderful leaders, Adama Dieng, Francis Deng, Juan Mendez, Alison Garitu, who's from Kenya, as you know, a really great woman. And by the way, one who's now working closely with the Aegis Trust in Rwanda. And now they've appointed a new special advisor who's from Zambia. And boy, is he ever qualified. So I think we're going to have a real success there in building the influence of that office in the UN. And right now, for instance, Genocide Watch has a project that we are doing with the UN to work with the artificial intelligence companies, who are huge, they're billions of dollars, to work with them to develop the software necessary to recognize hate speech and answer it. Not take it down, answer it. Taking it down is a form of censorship. A lot of people are opposed to that, especially Americans, because we've got this almost extreme position about free speech in the United States. I think it's frankly too extreme, but that's just my own view. Nevertheless, hate speech is one of the ways genocides get started. You have to use the dehumanizing language. The Rohingya, for instance, in Myanmar were called all those things, a disease in, the country and all this kind of stuff. And Muslims, and they would try to make them out to all be terrorists. That's the sort of dehumanizing language. So hate speech itself is a very important contributor to the culture that creates genocide. So that's what we're about to do with the AI companies. The project's just gotten started. I hope to have this cover hate speech in hundreds of languages. And that means we're going to have a lot of money to do it. That's why only the AI companies probably have that kind of money to do it. And so I'll be going out to, we're going to ask them to come to New York to meet with the special advisor and us and other members of the Alliance Against Genocide to develop that project. We've already incorporated the corporation that will be the basis for it, and it won't It won't exist because of donations. It'll exist because of investments by these AI companies. That's the vision we now have of one of the ways we can combat genocide. But we also need a new UN charter. The UN charter was written at the time of the colonial era. And that's why you've got the Perm Five, all with vetoes in the Security Council. They were all the colonial powers. They didn't want to give up any of their power. We need a new UN. It's past the colonial era. We need to develop a whole new charter. And would you believe this? In the UN charter itself, the current one, Article 109 provides the mechanism we need to do it. It says if you have 7 members of the Security Council, not even a majority, and you have a majority of the General Assembly vote to create what is called a general conference, they can write new amendments to the charter. So far, there's only been 3, I think, amendments ever made, but they didn't have to have general conferences to do those. This general conference would actually rewrite the whole charter. We would like to have a lot more emphasis on regional organizations, for instance, in the whole UN structure. The way the General Assembly voting system is set up so that China has the same number of votes as some little island out in the Pacific, I mean, it's crazy. And the Perm 5 veto system needs to go. It needs to be done away with. All of this needs to be rethought. But calling a general conference should be done, and it should be done within the next few years. So we're working on that one too. I want to put in a word for Rotary. I know that Rotary is a very, very important organization in the world because I grew up with a lifelong Rotarian. My father was a Rotarian. He was a bishop fellow, in fact. He was one of those people who just has dedicated himself to Rotary. I watched how he used Rotary in each of the communities. He was a pastor in the Rotary Club. As you know, a lot of times, a lot of the most important people in a community are members of the club, of the Rotary Club. They get together, every month or something, to have dinner together. By the way, one of the ways that people identify with each other, it is meals together. It's no accident that Jesus chose the Last Supper as the way to say goodbye to his disciples. The point is that when you eat together, you also partake of spiritual togetherness. And he knew that about Rotary. He got the Rotary people together in the little town we grew up in northern Illinois in the 1950s, before the Civil Rights Act. And it was a segregated town. All the blacks lived on the other side of the tracks, and so forth. And the realtor said, oh, well, yeah, the whites would object if we showed homes here in this white section to the black people. My father said, that's wrong. So he got a petition together, put together by the Ministerial Association and Rotary, and took it around town, got people to say, I would not object to having a, as they call them then, black person live in my block if my neighbors would not object. They got most of the people in the town to sign it. And they took it to the realtors and they said, see, stop redlining this town. So they began to integrate that town before any of those civil rights acts. When they asked my dad to raise money for a swimming pool in town, he knew the people who were the fathers of the town, a lot of them in Rotary. And they used to gather at a barbershop in downtown. Walter Dumelli was this Italian barber. My dad was as bald as I am, so he got prices at half price for a haircut. But anyway, Walter was a closet liberal. And these guys in the town who were planning this swimming pool had decided it was going to be a segregated pool. They weren't going to allow any blacks to swim in it. Well, Walter, when he was cutting my dad's hair once, said, they're going to make this a segregated pool. They're not going to allow any blacks. Well, my father, who was a charter member of the Congress of Racial Equality, he led the second sit-in in the history of the United States. after James Farmer led the first one. The Integrated Barbershop in Oberlin, Ohio. That was my father's sit-in, the second one in the United States history. He was a firm believer in equality, and so he knew who was going to build the swimming pool. Cephas Williams, a member of his church, the biggest contractor in town, and so he built all those big projects. He went to Cephas Williams. He said, "Ceph," he says, "if this is going to be a segregated swimming pool, I'm not only not going to raise money for it," because they'd asked him to raise money because my dad was a really good fundraiser. "I'm not only not going to raise money for it, I'm going to denounce it from the public, from the pulpit." That was it. That was the end of it. It was never a segregated swimming pool after that. My dad told me once, I never forget it. He said, "If you can get them by the heart and also by the pocketbook at the same time, you got them by the balls." I'm sorry to be a little, anyway, a little profane there, but that was exactly true. If you can make people realize that their conscience and also their economic interests can in fact agree, then you can accomplish a heck of a lot. And I know I saw it happen. So he was my inspiration. He was the one who taught me how to speak. I feel very, very, very lucky, very, very blessed, really, to be able to do this work. I know it was what God called me to do. One of the things I love about Africa is that I think Africans have a sense of the spiritual reality of the divine, of God, that is still so strong you can feel it. I know because I lived in a village that was, we danced our faith. And I know that's true in Uganda too. So I am hoping to enlist the Rotary International in this anti-genocide project around the world. I've been a member of Rotary. In fact, when I went to the Peace Corps in Ivory Coast, and I said, "How do you influence the important people in a country?" He says, "Join Rotary." So I did. I was the first Peace Corps volunteer there in Ivory Coast that had ever done that, I think. I was just a kid. Gee whiz, I was 24 years old or something. But I went to my first Rotary meeting, and across the table from me was the Minister of Health. He was 34, and I was in health education. We became very close friends. And I could never have done the things I was able to do there as a Peace Corps volunteer if I had not joined Rotary. I did the same in Swaziland, which is now, of course, got a new name and everything, but joined Rotary. Rotary is a place dedicated, it is an organization dedicated to peace. And boy, does the world need peace. My son was a U.S. Marine. We couldn't dissuade him. We couldn't make him not go into the Marines. He was determined to go into the Marines since he was a sophomore in high school. So he joins up. Right after he goes through Marine Corps basic training in Paris Island, 9/11 happens, and he gets sent to Iraq. He came back from Iraq terribly with PTSD, and I said, "Well, what's your conclusion, Ted?" He said, "Dad," he said, "war is the worst of all possible solutions." I've never forgotten him saying that. That came from a U.S. Marine. And do you know what he did? A few years later, he and his wife joined the Peace Corps, and they went to Kosovo. I said, "Why Kosovo?" They said, "Well, it was either that or Ukraine." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, it's because I understand war, and those people have been through war." So they asked to go to Mitrovica, where the Serbs and the Kosovar Albanians meet, right across the river, and worked. He taught Roma children, and she worked in a reconciliation organization right next to that bridge across that river, where the other people were Serbs and Kosovar Albanians worked together. You see, we can overcome. that was always, of course, it was the hymn we used to sing in the civil rights movement. We shall overcome. We can overcome. We can overcome the divisions that divide us. We can overcome our own sin, in fact. We can overcome even that because the power of God is great. It's the force. It's the force that made the universe, and it's the force that made each of us. And there's only one race, the human race.
Thank you very much indeed, Gregory. On behalf of the Rotary Peace Center at Makerere University, the Never Again Association, and myself, I would like to say thank you for this very, very inspiring conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.